I'm Bruce Caldwell, the director of the Center for the History of Political Economy, and I'm delighted to welcome Matt Ridley to our campus. Matt is a world-renowned author, journalist, and biologist, and he's written a whole bunch of different books. I'll just give you some sense of it by giving you some titles. One is on the sex and the evolution of human nature, called The Red Queen, and Ed Tower told me this was his favorite of Ridley's many books. Another on human instincts and the evolution of cooperation, called The Origins of Virtue, and most recently, The Rational Optimist, How Prosperity Evolves. And in fact, that book is a book that won in 2011 the Hayek Prize Best Book Award. And in fact, that Best Book Award was given by the Thomas Foundation, the same foundation, or Thomas Smith Foundation, the same foundation that sponsors this lecture series. So Matt has agreed to talk on his topic of the collective brain for, 35, 40 minutes, and he'll take some questions, and then he'll be joining my class at 3 o'clock over in the Social Sciences building. Okay, so thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Bruce, very much indeed, and thank you once again as one of the judges of the Hayek Prize for your incredibly generous and most surprising. I was truly honoured to receive that prize. Talking to the undergraduates here for a second, when I was your age, the future of the world was bleak. The grown-ups told us that the population explosion was unstoppable, the oil was going to run out, acid rain was going to destroy the forests, the desert was advancing at several miles a year, famine was inevitable, our sperm counts were going to fall. You know, it was all going wrong, basically, and we were all going to be miserable by the year 2012. When the world would come to a shuddering halt. And it didn't turn out that way. And so I've been reflecting on that in various stages of my life, and this is what kind of led me to write The Rational Optimist, to go back and look at what's happened in the last 30, 40, 50 years and say, well, actually living standards have improved pretty dramatically. Now, why is that? Where's it coming from? Why does it happen to our species and not to other species? Why is it human beings that experience this thing called a changing living standard? What is prosperity? And that's kind of what led me to write this book. And then, of course, to project forward and try and cheer you up by saying that bad as things that are at the moment, and they are, I admit, you know, the unemployment is high, the debt is terrible, the Eurozone seems determined to commit economic suicide, and so on. You know, it's not a great time. Nonetheless, in the big picture, in the long run, I think you guys are going to have a great life, and so are your children and your grandchildren, and here's why. So let's just first of all to persuade you that you are better off than your grandparents. Here's world GDP per capita over the last 400 years, two different estimates, one from Brad DeLong and one from Angus Maddison, and they basically show the extraordinary kick-up in human living standards that comes with the Industrial Revolution. This is per capita, this is corrected for inflation, etc., etc. But let's just see what happens if we project it forwards at the rate it's going at the moment, to the year 2100. It's a pretty amazing graph when you think about it like that, isn't it? What essentially that's saying is that if this continues for the rest of this century, the average citizen of the planet will have a GDP per capita, that is to say, value of goods and services that he or she produces, 2 to 4 times the size of the average American's GDP per capita today. So that's including Africans and Asians and everybody. It's an amazing goal if we can get to it, and if we can do it without destroying the planet on the way. There are recessions, there are setbacks, inevitably. This is US real GDP per capita between 1929 and 2009, and you can see both the Great Depression and the Great Recession, as we now call it, on this chart. So it's, you know, there are setbacks, but what happens in between is an inexorable, inevitable, and incremental improvement in GDP per capita. And it's not just that the rich are getting richer, the poor are also getting less poor. This is Salah E. Martin's data on people living on less than $1 a day corrected for inflation and as a proportion of the population going down steadily. And for a long time, Africa wasn't able to join in this party. In the 80s and 90s, Africa kind of went backwards. Poverty increased in Africa, living standards barely moved at all, and then suddenly it began to improve pretty dramatically in the mid-90s, and that fall in poverty rate in Africa has turned into a plummet in the last few years. Africa's just had its best decade in terms of economic growth. Its best few years, the last couple of years, have been tremendous in Africa. It hasn't had the recession, the Great Recession that the rest of us had. So it's worth reminding ourselves that, you know, even if things are bad in the West, they're not necessarily bad everywhere. Environmentalists sometimes say some pretty dire things, and this is one. I know this guy, he's a perfectly sensible guy, but he said it's blindingly obvious that completely unsustainable population growth in most of Africa will keep it permanently, hopelessly stuck in deepest, darkest poverty. I just don't think that's necessarily true. I think Africa is roughly where Asia was 20 or 30 years ago. So here's a quiz for you. Because in the end, it's not about money, is it? It's about time. What counts is how long it takes you to fulfill your needs. That's the real measure of your living standards. How long do you think it takes you to earn the price of a light bulb burning for an hour? An 18-watt compact fluorescent bulb burning for an hour, which would give you about 1,200 lumen hours. Hands up those who think you only have to work for half a second if you're on the average wage to earn that much light. There's several hands up. What about 5 seconds? A few more. 1 minute? One or two? 10 minutes. Who has to work for 10 minutes to earn that much light? Nobody. Yeah, right. Okay, here's another quiz. Back in 1800, your ancestor, how long did he or she have to work to earn that much light from a tallow candle? Let's start with 10 minutes. Anybody want 10 minutes? On the average wage at the time. Nobody thinks 10 minutes, 30 minutes. This is like an auction, isn't it? Nobody thinks 30 minutes. 1 hour. Quite a lot of hands. Anyone who's read the book, by the way, is not allowed to vote. 6 hours. Some people think 6 hours. Right, okay, well, here's the answers anyway, and this comes from work by William Nordhaus. Basically, it's half a second today. That's how long you have to work to earn the price of light for that time. By the way, that was 1997. It's probably less than half a second now. And back in 1950, your grandparents had to work for 8 seconds. So that's 7.5 seconds that you've got that your grandparents didn't have, in which you can fulfill a different need, because you don't have to fulfill your lighting need. Or if you're like my kids, you just leave the lights on. That's economic growth in the end. That's what it is. It's shortening the amount of time you take to fulfill a need and therefore fulfilling more needs. Back in 1880 with a kerosene lamp, it would have taken about 15 minutes, and some of you were dead right, 6 hours in 1800 with a tallow candle. So the average person simply couldn't afford a candle in 1800. This is US average wages. Obviously, you know, it varies in different parts of the world and so on. Another quiz. Hands up those who think we are healthier than 50 years ago. Yeah, most of you think we're healthier. Happier? Not so many, a few. Cleverer? Arrogant fellas. Cleaner? Yeah, most people think cleaner. Kinder? Not very many, one or two. Freer? Yeah, most people probably. More peaceful? About half. I should be really taking the opposite vote on each one, shouldn't I? More equal. Again, about half, I would say. Well, I think the answer is yes to all of these. I'm not actually going to prove it, but I am going to show you some suggestive evidence. First of all, healthier. We're living about 30% longer than we did 50 years ago. Lifespans increase. This is globally, all around the world. Lifespans increasing at the rate of about 5 hours per day, which is rather an extraordinary thought. And that's because we're defeating premature mortality. This is British data, but it's much the same here. You can see the disappearance of infection as a cause of mortality around the beginning of the 1950s. Respiratory disease pretty soon afterwards. Circulatory disease, a spectacular fall from the 1970s onwards. That's heart attacks and stroke. Even cancer starting to tick down, and you can see it more clearly here with US data that cancer rates, adjusted for age, obviously, because you do get more cancer if you live longer, are starting to go down. Not expected, again, an environmentalist said in the 70s, US life expectancy will drop to 42 years by the end of the century due to cancer epidemics. Didn't happen. These were epidemics that were going to be caused by all the pesticides we were putting into the food supply. Happier. Well, there is, for a long time, until really quite recently, people thought there was no correlation between wealth and happiness. It's now clear that if you do a big enough sample and you do your work clearly enough, you do find that there is a correlation both within countries and between countries and within individual lifetimes. As people get richer, on the whole, they get happier. It's not linear, so you can't get the same increment of happiness for each $100, as it were. After a bit, you run into diminishing returns here, and it's clearly not. The data's all over the place. It's clearly not a perfect correlation, and it varies according to different continents. But that could be just how you translate the words, etc. Eastern Europeans are unhappy. Latin Americans are happy, generally, it seems. And of course, it's possible to be very rich and very unhappy. But then that's okay because it makes the rest of us happy. Now, cleverer, this is the interesting one. Obviously, people are better educated these days. They spend more time in education. But there's this weird phenomenon called the Flynn effect, of which this is an illustration, not a very good illustration, but it's an illustration, which is that IQ scores are going up at the rate of about 3 points a decade. Nobody quite knows why. The improvement is all in the questions in the IQ tests that you can't kind of teach. They're sort of reasoning ability questions that reflect least what's going on in education. So it's as if there's something in the water that's making us just that little bit cleverer. It's probably the enrichment of our environments. We're just exposed to many more visual and other influences in our youth. You don't want to claim too much for this, but when people say, oh, they were much brighter in the old days, if your professors start saying that to you, it's not true. And of course, we're cleaner. I mean, the quality of the air has been improving dramatically ever since the 1970s. And remember, I was told it wasn't going to happen. By 1985, air pollution will have reduced the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth by half, said Life magazine in 1970. Now, this isn't happening everywhere. I mean, Beijing has more air pollution than it did, whereas most American cities are much cleaner than they were. Kinder. This is UK data, but it's pretty similar elsewhere. Donations to charity as a proportion of GDP going up. It's pretty surprising, isn't it? Everybody thinks we're getting more selfish. Doesn't seem to be true. Freer. The number of people living in countries that are defined as free goes up, and the number living in countries defined as unfree goes down. And this graph ends before you get to the Arab Spring, so there's a couple more red countries turned green in the last year or so. Let's hope they stay there. More peaceful. Here's the data that Steven Pinker cites in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, and it comes from other studies, showing that your probability of being a victim of homicide in Europe is dramatically lower than it was in the Middle Ages. And he goes through a whole series of graphs showing exactly the same, a decline in violence, in war, in torture, in genocide, in child abuse, rape, infanticide, slavery, wife-beating, execution, racial violence, homophobia, all on the decline in this book. He shows in recent decades, particularly in the West, but even in the world as a whole. So here's one of his war graphs, for example, showing that the 2000s is the decade with the lowest number of deaths in warfare on record. Now, records only go back to the 1940s, right at the end of the World War II, but nonetheless, it's pretty amazing to think that, because, of course, it wasn't a very peaceful decade. It wasn't a great decade for America or indeed Britain. A lot of deaths in Afghanistan and Iraq. But globally, war almost looks like it's petered out. Now, of course it hasn't. It'll be back, But it's not a more dangerous world in that sense, although people think it is. Now, the equal one is really interesting, because inequality is going up in America, and it's going up in parts of Europe, and it's even going up in China. But in the world as a whole, it's going down, because China and India and poor countries like that are getting rich faster than rich countries are getting rich. So they're catching up. So everybody's moving towards the middle. So actually, the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of inequality, has been going down. This is data from Saleh Martin again. So can it go on, this, before I come to the explanation of where it's coming from? Or am I like the man who falls out of the skyscraper and, as he passes the second story, says, so far so good? Well, we're on course for the population to hit about 10 billion by the end of this century, which is one of the things that, it was the things that we could run into constraints. That's what a lot of people think, is we're going to run into constraints from resources, from population, from food, from climate change, from one of these things. And it's worth remembering that the population problem is getting easier. At current rates of increase, we're increasing the population at the rate of about 1% a year, whereas it was 2% a year in the 1960s. So, and the total number added to the world population each year has been falling since the 1980s. We're only going to increase the world population by about 1.5 times in this century, if the UN projections are right, whereas we quadrupled it in the 20th century. So if we coped with that in the 20th century, then we can probably cope with a 1.5 times increase in the 21st. Still, we're going to need a lot of land to feed 9 billion people in the middle of the century, or 10 billion at the end. How much land do we need? Well, currently we crop about 15 million square kilometers. If we were to add 2 billion people, we're going to need a lot more land, particularly if we want them to eat chickens and pigs and all the other things we like to eat. If we were to try and feed 9 billion people with organic agriculture, that is to say, get our fertilizer from growing it rather than fixing it in nitrogen factories, then we would need an awful lot more land. So that probably isn't going to happen, at least on a large scale. But if we were to treble the yields of farming over the next 50 years or so, then we could actually feed 9 billion people from an area smaller than we currently feed 7 billion from. So we could actually spare land for rainforests. We could actually return land to forests and other uses, as indeed we're doing in parts of North America and Europe and so on at the moment, where forest cover is increasing. And we've just done that. We did that in the last 60 years. This is the amount of land that is devoted to growing rice, wheat and maize, the staples that produce about 60% of our calories. That's the bottom line, and it's pretty well flat. We haven't increased the acreage devoted to growing these crops, but the top line shows that we've roughly trebled the amount of food we get out of them. And again, we were told throughout this period that it couldn't be done. Farmers can no longer keep up with rising demand for food, and famine is inevitable, said Lester Brown. But in every continent, the calories available per head have gone up steadily. They've not gone up nearly as fast in Africa as they have in Asia, but they have gone up. So per head, the amount of food we produce, despite the doubling of the population over 50 years, has increased. And crop prices have fallen. They are actually, in real terms, well, they're not at the low at the moment because they've just shot up because of biofuels, but they haven't shot up very much, not compared with where they were in the 70s and in the 40s. What about climate change? Well, the global temperature has risen. These are 5 different ways of measuring it, but it's risen less than expected. When people say climate change is happening faster than expected, it's not true. Here's 2 of the measures, one of them satellite, one of them ground temperatures, and you can see they're now below the low estimate for where temperature would have got to by now, made in 1990, and the high estimate was the one based on business as usual carbon dioxide emissions. In fact, we've emitted more carbon dioxide than the top estimate. So it's happening, but it's not necessarily happening particularly fast. Sea level rise is also happening, 2.86 millimeters a year, and just seems to be slowing down a little at the end. That's not a lot, 2.86 millimeters a year. It's about a foot per century. Greenland is losing ice, yes, but at the rate of 150 gigatons a year, which sounds like a lot of ice, but it's actually 0.5% per century. At that rate, it would take 10,000 years to melt the whole of Greenland. So I'm someone who thinks that climate change is happening, but I'm not yet convinced that it's going to be rapid or urgent. And even if it does happen, we're going to adapt to it to some degree. This is showing the number of deaths and the rate of death from extreme weather, that is to say, droughts, floods and storms in the world over the last century or so. And if you ignore the first 2 decades, when the statistics weren't very well collected, then you can see that basically we've seen a spectacular decline, a 98% decline in your probability of dying as a result of droughts, floods and storms. That's not because the weather's got less dangerous. I probably don't need to say that here. You probably had tornadoes last year, did you, around here? It's not because of that. It's because we've got better communication, better transport, better housing, better warnings, better medicine, all these different things. In other words, people do adapt. Here's another example of that, malaria. Malaria was all around the world in 1900. You could find it in Asia, in North America. I suspect North Carolina's red on that map at the top. By 2007, it had retreated to Central Africa and a few parts of Southeast Asia and Latin America. And the blue bit on the bottom chart shows where malaria's got better, not worse, and it's got better in almost every part of the world. That wasn't because the world got less congenial to mosquitoes. In fact, we had a warming in the 20th century. It was because people used DDT or drained swamps or moved indoors and shut the windows, or all these different things that you can do to reduce malaria transmission. So we will adapt, I think, to climate change. Nor do I think running out of fossil fuels is going to prevent this process happening, because the quantity of fossil fuels we've so far consumed is pretty small compared with what's available in the crust. Now, some of it, like the dark blue stuff on the right, which is the methane clathrates, the hydrated methanes on the ocean floor, may never be available as a fuel source. It may never prove economic to work out how to get them. The Chinese and the Japanese are trying, but nobody's worked out how to do it yet. And a lot of the coal may not be accessible, etc. But the green bar on the right is the shale gas, which until a few years ago was thought to be pretty well not a resource, because it wasn't economic to get it out. It's now a huge resource worldwide, so that's made a difference. So I don't think myself, although you will see, obviously, the cheapest versions of various fossil fuels running out, I don't think that will prevent economic growth. And if you look at other metals, other resources like metals, you can see that basically they've been getting spectacularly cheaper over the last couple of centuries. Some people say to me, yes, but okay, that means that things might go on getting better, but wouldn't they only get better if we anticipated the worst and did something to head it off? Isn't it necessary to be a pessimist in order to achieve optimism, as it were? And I don't think that's true, because here's 6 people who made innovations that helped improve human living standards. Archimedes, Al-Khwarizmi, who invented algebra, Fibonacci, who brought Indian numerals to Europe, George Stephenson, the pioneer of steam, Thomas Edison, Steve Jobs. Every single one of them lived in the richest place on earth at the time, which is an amazing thought when you think about it. And every single one of them was driven not by desperation. They weren't, living in a society where everyone was desperate and they had terrible problems to solve. They were driven by ambition, by an extraordinary feeling that they could improve the world, even though they didn't have to, as it were. And then sometimes people say, well, isn't it complacent to say everything's going to be fine? Do you know what? I don't think it is, because I think what I'm arguing here is that good as this world looks at the moment in these pictures, it's nothing to what we could achieve in the decades to come. In other words, we've hardly started yet on improving human living standards. And the people who I worry about being complacent are the ones saying, let's try new technologies in case they're dangerous, which is essentially what the precautionary principle says. So I think that we need to try new technologies, because today's technologies just ain't good enough. They're too dirty, they're too dangerous, they're too expensive, and so on. So anyway, that's the optimist part of my title. But what about rational? And this is where I come to the collective brain. How is this possible? Why human beings? What is the process by which we raise our living standards? And essentially I'm arguing that it's an evolutionary process, and this is very much a sort of Hayekian point, that Hayek was very interested in Darwinism, and he absolutely thought that there were parallels between economic evolution and biological evolution. And I think that's right, because if you look at technologies, they show all the features of an evolutionary system. They show, for example, descent with modification. Old stone axes give rise to polished stone axes, which are clearly the ancestors of copper axes, of bronze axes, of iron axes. You can see these kind of family trees for every technology you look at. You can see the pattern of descent with modification, which is characteristic of an evolutionary system. You see succession and extinction. You see some technologies come and some technologies go, just like you do in the fossil record of animals. And you see random variation, or at least partially random variation. That is to say, when you invent a new technology like the airplane, you don't just continually improve it, you try different things. You try different shapes of tailplane, for example, to see what works. So there's a degree of randomness in the variation which we try in order to come up with good new ideas. And when we get a good idea, we replicate it, just like evolution does. That's what evolution does essentially, is a successful organism gets replicated more than an unsuccessful one. And that comes about through competition in technology, just as it does in biology. Essentially what I'm saying is well put by this guy, Art Fry, who invented the Post-it note at 3M. And he said innovation is a numbers game. You have to go through 5,000 to 6,000 raw ideas to find one successful business. So in other words, trial and error is a huge part of the way we develop new technologies, the way we innovate. But there's another feature, and this comes back to my book, The Red Queen. There's another feature of evolutionary systems that is necessary for evolution to happen. And in biology, it's recombination, or as we usually call it, sex. In other words, you have to bring together different genes from different organisms and mix them and remix them, recombine them to make new combinations. And if you do that, you have a dramatic effect on evolution. You essentially you accelerate it pretty dramatically. This is a creature which hasn't had sex for 80 million years. It's called the Deloitte Rotifer. You can find it in gutters. And it used to be a real puzzle to biologists because they thought, how can this be? How can it evolve without having sex? It turns out that it's invented a superior alternative to sex. It basically eats its companions and gets the genes from that, which is horizontal gene transfer is the technical term, but I think eating it is a better description. Now, what's key about sex is that it makes evolution cumulative. That is to say, it means you don't have to choose between good ideas. You can add both good ideas. Let me give you an example. Here's an asexual population going along, and you get one green mutation, one red mutation. The green one's better, the red one has to go extinct. But if there's a sexual population, at some point an individual can inherit both the green one and the red one from different parents. So what sex does, it enables you to draw upon inventions wherever they happen, anywhere in your species. You don't have to just get it from your own lineage. You can get it from anywhere in the species. And I'm arguing that there is a process in culture, in technology, in economics, that is exactly equivalent to sex, in that it has this effect on cultural evolution. And I'll come back to what that is in a minute. Here's an object that sits on my desk at home. It's an Ashwalian hand axe from 500,000 years ago, of the kind used by Homo erectus. It's a beautiful thing. And right next to it one day, I suddenly noticed is an object of exactly the same size and shape. And of course, they're both designed to fit the human hand. That's why they're the same size and shape. But the difference is rather intriguing, because the object on the left is made from a single substance, stone, whereas the object on the right is made from plastic and metal and silicon and all these other different things. And not only that, it embodies different ideas. The idea of computing, the idea of the mouse, the idea of semiconductors, ideas that occurred to different people in different times and different places. So my argument is that, just as I showed with that evolution of sex point, in order to draw these ideas together from different people at different times and different places in our technologies, we have to have a mechanism for doing that. All our technologies are like this when you think about it. They come about because two ideas meet and mate. This is my favorite example. It's called the pill camera. It takes a picture of your insides on the way through. It came about after a conversation between a gastroenterologist and a guided missile designer. Because you see, if you say, well, human beings have culture and animals don't, that's actually not true. There's culture in all sorts of other animals. Chimpanzees teach each other the traditions of how to crack nuts with rocks. And so, but they don't have a cumulative culture. They don't have a culture where you add new technologies to old ones to make complex new technologies. And that's what I think is lacking. And why is it lacking? Because no other animal does this. No other animal is in the habit of regularly swapping one thing for another with other people, with strangers. The habit of exchange with strangers. You give me what you're good at making, I give you what I'm good at making, has an extraordinary effect. And I think that has been playing the same role in cultural evolution, in technological evolution, as sex has been playing in biological evolution. And we are really the only creature that does this. As Adam Smith famously said, no man ever saw a dog make fair and deliberate exchange of a bone with another dog. And why does exchange make us richer? Why does it make us better off? Well, in the end, the argument really boils down to this simple idea, which occurred to a London stockbroker in 1817 called David Ricardo, and which goes under the description of comparative advantage. He wasn't the first to think of this in a way. This was Smith's idea, but it was beautifully put by Ricardo. And what he was trying to do was explain why it pays a country to trade with another country, even if the first country is better at making everything than the second country. But if you rephrase it in individual terms, I think it's rather interesting. So here's a version of the story. Adam and Oz, two blokes sitting around a fire in a cave in the Stone Age, and they both need a spear and an axe to go hunting. Adam takes 4 hours to make a spear and 3 hours to make an axe, whereas Oz takes 1 hour to make a spear and 2 hours to make an axe. So Oz is better than Adam at both spears and axes. He doesn't need Adam. Adam is a waste of space. Except, of course, he isn't, because if Oz were to make 2 spears and Adam were to make 2 axes and they were to trade, then they would each have saved an hour of work. Oz would have worked for 2 hours instead of 3 and Adam for 6 hours instead of 7. But of course this is only true because Oz is better at making spears, whereas Adam is better at making axes. But then once they start doing this, that's going to become true. In other words, the more they specialize, the more value there is in exchange. The more they exchange, the more value there is in specialization. So this is a kind of fast breeder reactor. The more you do of it, the more value there is in it. And I think this is sort of the grand theme of human history. As we expand this habit of exchange and specialization, so we expand the value of it as well. And so it gets more and more valuable to us. And as we contract it, it goes in the other direction. If you go back to this image again and ask yourself who made each of the objects. I mean, the axe was almost certainly made by the man who used it. You can actually find where people made these things. You can see the chips on the ground, and they quite often made them after they'd made a kill. So this would be the butchering tool after you've killed a rhinoceros or whatever, and you're about to start butchering it. But the object on the right was made for me by other people. They were part of a project called Make a Computer Mouse for Matt Ridley, and there were lots and lots of them. There were hundreds, thousands, perhaps even millions of them involved in this project, because there was a guy in Brazil who was growing coffee that was going to be drunk by a man on an oil rig who was drilling for oil, whose oil was going to be used in a factory to make plastic, where the plastic was going to be used in the mouse factory, etc., etc. They were all working for me. That's rather amazing, isn't it? It's very kind of them. Because having people working for you is how you get to be rich. That's sort of the definition of being rich. It's a fair bet that Louis XIV didn't have to make his silly outfits for himself. Louis XIV had 498 people to prepare his dinner every night. But then a bunch of tourists going around Versailles today, each of them has 498 people to prepare their dinner tonight. They're working in bistros and cafes and restaurants and shops all over Paris, but they're still able, at an hour's notice, to produce a good meal for any of these people. Probably a slightly better meal than Louis XIV had, more likely to have mangoes in it and less likely to have salmonella in it, for example. So we've all got the lifestyle of kings because we've all got lots of people working for us. But we're also working for them. It's a mutual exchange thing. I think that's the story of prosperity in a nutshell, as all sorts of other things like amplifying it with cheap energy and so on is helpful, but there we go. We're not the only creature that does this. There are other animals where one individual works for another and vice versa. And the classic example is the social insects, such as these ants, where here's a worker feeding a queen, and the worker works for the queen, but the queen also works for the worker. And there's a difference, though, from us, which is that they only do this within the colony. And the colony is just a big family. Everybody's related to everybody, so they only do it within the kin network. Because what they do is essentially they also do a division of labour that we don't do. They do a reproductive division of labour. They delegate reproduction to a specialised caste, to the queen. That's something we don't like to do. It's something we rather treasure the ability to do our own reproduction for ourselves. Even in England, we don't expect the Queen to do it for us. So when did we start working for each other in this way? Well, I suspect the oldest version is probably the sexual division of labour in hunter-gatherers, between generally male hunters and female gatherers. It isn't always quite that simple, but there's always a foraging difference in all existing hunter-gatherer societies between the way men forage and the way women forage. And it's rather a beautiful system. If I could illustrate it by this case of the Hadza, the woman knows that in order to get access to high-protein meat when she needs it, she doesn't have to go out on an exhausting and dangerous hunt. She just has to make sure she digs up enough extra roots to share some with a man in exchange for meat. And the man knows that in order to have a staple carbohydrate diet of roots available every day, he doesn't have to go out digging in the hot sun. All he has to do is make sure that when he does kill a warthog out hunting, it's a big enough one so he can share some with the woman. So both sides are raising each other's standard of living in this exchange. They're not consciously doing it or anything like that, and it's overlaid with all sorts of cultural wrinkles that make it feel much less like an economic exchange, but that's essentially what it is. And when you think about it, that's what farming is too. Farming is simply extending this to other species. The sheep are working for the man in this picture, but the man is working for the sheep, and the dog is working for the sheep, and the man is working for the dog, and the dog is working for the man. Everybody's working for each other in this picture. When did we start doing this among strangers? Because I think that's really the key question. So it's really a question of when was trade invented? When's the oldest evidence for trade? And at the moment it looks like about 120,000 years ago. That's 10 times as old as agriculture in Africa. And this is an example of the evidence. These are shell beads, beads made from shells. And the point is they're Mediterranean shells, but they're found 100 miles inland in Algeria. So these objects are moving long distances. Now, you just don't see that before this time. And it's around now that you start to see objects moving long distances. How do we know that long-distance movement of objects is evidence of trade? We look at modern aborigines, like modern hunter-gatherers like aborigines in Australia, and we find that their objects also moved long distances in the recent times through trade, not through migration. So things moving hundreds of miles is a sign that traders got going. Now, this is something Neanderthals never did. They were very clever people, the Neanderthals. They had slightly bigger brains than we do by the end. They were beautifully adapted to the European climate and niche, and they had a good thing going. But they succumbed to these African invaders, that's us. And one of the reasons, I think, probably the main reason, was that they weren't able to draw upon ideas and substances from a long way away. Because if you look at, for example, this cave in the Caucasus, what you find is, this is data from evidence from about 30,000 years ago, that the modern humans, the ex-African people who were living in this cave, were using objects that came from a long way away. Whereas the Neanderthals in a different cave elsewhere in the valley around the same time were only ever using local material. Now that means that through their trading network, the modern people have got access to ideas, to new technologies, to new inventions, to new products, to they're operating a sort of collective brain. They're no longer reliant just on their own brain size. And what happens when you cut people off from exchange networks? Tasmania provides a very nice example of this. Tasmania became an island 10,000 years ago. Up until that point it was a peninsula. Then rising sea levels cut it off. And after that period, not only did the Tasmanians not share in any of the inventions that happened elsewhere in Australia, so for example the boomerang was invented after that and the Tasmanians never got it, but they actually disinvented some technologies. They actually gave up bone tools, for example. And the argument that's been put forward by Joe Henrich is that what's going on here is that the population size is simply too small to sustain the different specialized skills that you need to keep some of these technologies alive. it's a demographic effect. It's not because there's anything stupid about the Tasmanians, it's that their collective brain is not big enough to sustain all the technologies they need. The same did not happen in Tierra del Fuego, even though it's an equally remote island. Why not? Because the Magellan Strait is narrow, whereas the Bass Strait is wide. There was trading contact with the rest of South America. So they had access to a collective brain the size of South America. So essentially what I'm saying is that the secret to understanding human beings is to realize that they've always operated the cloud. They've always done crowdsourcing. They've always done wikinomics. They've shared ideas in a way that enables them to be more than the sum of their parts. This is fishing tackle from the Western Pacific before Western contact, and the more trading contact an island had, the more sophisticated its fishing tackle. People are operating these collective brains. Because if you go back to this image one more time and ask yourself not just who made the mouse, but who knew how to make the mouse. And of course the answer is nobody. And I'm famously quoting the essay by Leonard Read, the very Hayekian essay called I, Pencil, in which a pencil tries to work out how it came to be made, and it realizes that millions of people contributed to the manufacture of the pencil, but not one of them knew how to make a pencil. I mean, the person who runs the pencil company doesn't know, he just knows how to run a company. The person on the assembly line doesn't know because he doesn't know how to chop down trees, and the person chopping down trees doesn't know because he doesn't know how to mine graphite. All these different things that you need to know are distributed in the human population, and this is true of every technology we use, that there's nobody who knows how to make them. We're actually capable of doing things that are beyond our brain power because we're effectively using a collective intelligence. And so what I'm arguing is that prosperity comes because when we move from living in small villages to big cities and then to a great big networked world, we move from having a small collective brain to some bigger collective brains to one gigantic collective brain. And so what I'm arguing essentially is that now that we've connected all the brains on the planet, or pretty well all of them, not all of them obviously yet, but given that we've now got the capability for ideas to meet and mate much more rapidly over much longer distances than ever before, that those estimates of how quickly human living standards can rise might be cautious, might be pessimistic compared with what is actually going to happen. That's a real brain, by the way. It looks very like the internet, which is what that is, because it is a brain. So, in going from the individual intelligence that enabled us to make objects like this to the collective intelligence embodied in an object like this, I think that's what's enabled us to transform our living standards. Let me end with this quotation. We cannot absolutely prove that those are in error who say society has reached a turning point, that we've seen our best days. But so said all who came before us, and with just as much apparent reason. On what principle is it that with nothing but improvement behind us, we're to expect nothing but deterioration before us? Well, that wasn't me. That was Thomas Babington Macaulay, the historian, writing in 1830. Already then he was fed up with the pessimists saying the world can't get better, and yet it had hardly started getting better. Thank you very much.
Questions, and I'll just let you field them.
Yeah, your Bruce's introduction reminded me of the Red Queen hypothesis by Levi Valen.
Yep.
And the hypothesis image there is, at least in his claim, was a universal biological hypothesis that every species has to keep running in order to stay where it is. The story that you tell here is about a species that's learned how to keep running, but to way outpace other species. So that leaves me two questions. One, is that correct? Is there something unique about us biologically that distinguishes us from the rule that's governed life on Earth ever before? Mm-hmm. And secondly, what impact, since there's a limited amount of energy coming to Earth, does that have on the other species if we use more and more?
Yeah. Great question. And yes, I think we have, developed a way of evolving that enables us to evolve much, much quicker. Because we do it by cultural evolution now. We don't evolve, we don't evolve by the death of unfit people. In fact, we keep unfit people alive more than we used to. So people don't have to die for the species to advance. Ideas have to die now. And that's a much quicker process. So we've developed a form of evolution that's going to go much quicker because it doesn't rely on, the 25 years to mature an organism and then test it in the environment. You can test it in minutes or days on a computer or whatever. So in that sense, yes, we've developed a form of evolution that's going to make us superior, if that's the word, or dominant, maybe is the word, to other species wherever we want to be in ecological terms. Although it doesn't prevent the Red Queen problem re-emerging amongst ourselves, and we see that in spades. My country now has wealth beyond the imaginings of Victorians, but in Victorian times we were the richest country on earth. Now we're about middle of the rankings, if you see what I mean. So the Red Queen phenomenon of running to stay in the same place is going to happen in terms of relativity continuing. What about the problem that we're going to use up all the energy on the planet and leave nothing for the rest of biodiversity? Actually, there's a rather interesting calculation that shows that might not be happening. It's called HANP, Human Appropriation of Net Primary Productivity. There's a Viennese professor called Helmut Habel makes this calculation. And what he's essentially arguing is how much of the greenery on the planet do we consume, or our domestic animals consume? And the answer is about 24% at the moment, which is a slightly lower number than people thought. But he's very Teutonic. He's gone into terrific precision to get at this number. But he then points out that there are large parts of the planet where we're actually boosting the amount of foliage that's grown and then pinching a large amount for ourselves. So in Northern Europe, for example, we pinch about 40% of the greenery for us and our pets. But we also boost yields by about 40%. So there's about as much there as if we weren't there at all. And actually, I think we could, the opposite happens, for example, in parts of Central Asia, parts of North Africa, where the goats eat all the greenery before it gets going. So we're suppressing the amount of greenery that grows, as it were, because of sunlight, and then we're stealing it all. So we're not only reducing the amount that's available in the first place, we're then even further reducing it. Now, if we could get the ecology of our species to the point where we're like Northern Europe and not like Central Africa, as it were, then we could get to the point where we're actually feeding ourselves and fueling ourselves and so on. Because there again, by going to fossil fuels, we take the pressure off the foliage. And so we leave that energy for wildlife. If you look at a satellite photograph of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, the border is extraordinarily easy to see because it's brown on one side and green on the other, because the Dominican Republic subsidizes propane for use in cooking, and the Haitians rely on charcoal for cooking. So again, fossil fuels have done some good things. Long answer, good question, thanks.
You mentioned really briefly the association between infectious disease control and human welfare. That's one of the biggest factors of the 20th century. But a little sort of caveat for your thesis, and that is currently there are two problems with that. One, the evolution and dispersion of antibiotic-resistant genes. Two, the evolution of zoonotic diseases, which actually comes with intensification of especially factory farmed animals. And that seems to be an increasing problem, one that's possibly increasing exponentially over the next 20, 30 years. It's not clear yet, but at least many scientists seem to fear that. So do you worry about that?
On the whole, not, and I'll tell you why. Again, all my life I've been reading that we're going to see hantavirus, Ebola virus, swine flu, bird flu, SARS, whatever, go epidemic, and they never do, with one exception, and that's AIDS. The AIDS epidemic is a serious zoonotic issue that's come into our species and done terrible harm. Whereas we are plagued with thousands of casual contact diseases. We call them colds usually, but there are literally 200 adenoviruses, I don't know how many rhinoviruses that we all pass. I'm sure someone in this room's got one. Why are mild diseases doing so well and dangerous diseases doing so poorly? Well, I read a very interesting statistic just this week, actually, about tuberculosis, which was that 100 years ago, the average person with tuberculosis managed to infect 10 other people. 50 years ago, they managed to infect 5 other people. Today, they infect less than 1 on average globally, which is why tuberculosis is declining. There are some communities where it's increasing, if you see what I mean. We're living, and why is that? Well, because 100 years ago, you shared a bed with strangers. You know, you slept in the day, he slept in the night, you lived in 6 people in a room, you coughed and spluttered on each other. Today, you know, you have a shower every morning, you live in your own bed, etc., etc. I presume you do. I'm not making assumptions here, etc. Do you see what I mean? So I think we're creating a world in which casual contact diseases are going to have a great time. They're ones that want us to stay healthy. They want us turning up at seminars. They don't want us... whereas, of course, insect-borne diseases and waterborne diseases don't need you to stay healthy, so they can get really virulent, and you know, cholera and malaria and things, because the malaria actually wants you lying down in sweating in a room, so the mosquitoes can find you, etc. So I think we're creating conditions for for mild diseases to spread, but I think we're not creating conditions for virulent ones, and that's why you see these flu epidemics go low virulence pretty quickly. But I may be wrong. You know, of course, something horrible could happen, and we've got to be careful.
I'm curious where you've made a compelling argument that basically things are getting better, but I'm wondering where nuclear weapons factor into your calculus, right? So, yes, we have war is not occurring as frequently, violent death is not occurring as frequently, but yet on the other perspective, we've gotten a lot better at potentially really killing ourselves very quickly and very rapidly. So do you see nuclear weapons as part of your argument as the ultimate deterrence that has led to more peace? Do you see it as kind of just a separate thing where one mistake, and even though we're improving, everything goes up in flames?
That's really, again, a nice question. And the best thing I can do is refer you to Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. He has a very interesting discussion of exactly this area. And he discusses this point that, you know, an era of 100 years of peace followed by total annihilation looks on average just as bad as an era in which we're killing each other all along at a lower rate. So, you know, maybe it's just got more lumpy, the death rate, as it were. But he makes a fairly compelling argument that nuclear weapons turn out to be tremendously good at deterrence. They have tremendously good deterrent value, but turn out to be really quite useless. I mean, even if you're a crackpot North Korean dictator, what can you really do? You know, you blow up one city in North America. So what? They're going to come down on you like a ton of bricks. Do you know what I mean? So, as a practical weapon of war, they're all but useless, he ends up concluding, which is why they got used so little. Now, that, I suppose, is the old mad argument in a new form, mutually assured deterrence. And I'm not displaying huge confidence in it. I do still think that it's worrying that we have got. I certainly think it's worrying that, you know, Pakistani Islamic militants may get close to having their fingers on triggers. I certainly think it's horrible to think of the Kim family in North Korea having their fingers on the trigger, and so on. You know, I don't want to be blasé about that. But don't forget that we did destroy 75% of US and Soviet nuclear arsenals after 1989. It's quite a lot. You know, I mean, we haven't got rid of them all, obviously, but and we've still got enough to send us all to Kingdom Come several times over. But you know, things have got a little bit better. It's certainly a lot better than the early 1960s, you know, the Cuban Missile Crisis time, when we did come clearly quite close to disaster. So I think nuclear weapons may have played a role in improving peace, generally, although the Cold War itself led to a lot of proxy wars. They just didn't include nuclear weapons. And equally, the decline, the nuclear weapons themselves may be getting safer, is what the safety catches may be getting stronger, I suppose I would be saying. But I can't. An accident could throw all of this off. I mean, it could be an asteroid from outer space, or it could be an idiotic dictator on this planet. But something could go. I'm not This isn't a forecast. This is just a what could happen.
There was actually an article over the weekend on about the new weapons that were being made for nuclear bombs to fight against Iran's bunkers. I was wondering what your thoughts on that was.
I don't know about that. These are bunker-busting nuclear bombs. I don't know is the answer. I'd have to read that up.
If the future can be so rosy, how do you explain the proclivity of humans to be rather gloomy?
It's a great question. And two answers to that. One is that, well, first of all, just point out, we're not actually that gloomy about our own lives. We're gloomy about the species, and you get a lot of mileage in the press. Journalists are always love doom stories, politicians love doom stories, et cetera, et cetera. But in their individual lives, people aren't that pessimistic. They actually think they're going to earn more than they do in their careers, and they think they're going to stay married longer than they do, for example. So, there are all sorts of little optimism biases that we show in our individual lives. But it's true that we are much more avid consumers of catastrophe stories than good luck stories. And, try selling a newspaper editor a story that, things got slightly better last year. He's not going to put it on the front page, whereas things might get horribly worse. He will put on the front page. I don't know is the answer why that is, but two thoughts. One is that we could have an instinctive inbuilt tendency to find bad news more salient, because it was more important in our evolutionary past. You and I are walking to a waterhole. This is Rob Biomaster's example. You and I are walking to a waterhole. You say, "Don't go that way. I think there's a lion behind that rock." And I say, "It's going to be all right. Everything's fine. The world's perfect." I'm dead, and your genes are in the next generation. So the pessimist genes spread faster than the optimist genes. And the other possibility is that the past was okay. The past turned out all right. We both got here today. My plane didn't crash. But it might not, we cannot say that about the future. And so the inherent uncertainty of the future makes us cautious, makes us pessimistic, makes us worried. That was a point that was put to me by somebody after my book came out, and I think it's quite a nice one. So in other words, my plane may crash this evening.
So the mechanism that you have working here is that through trade and exchange, ideas move. And there's things that we trade and exchange much more rapidly than we do other things.
Mm-hmm.
So goods, services, technology, we can see, that mechanism working much faster in certain things than, say, like languages, and then maybe even more institutions of governments and governance.
Yes.
And so how do you I would like to hear you comment in terms of how you think about these more longer term processes, or these different types of institutions that we may not have as many opportunities to engage in trade or to pit against each other in this competitive process to get these evolutionarily.
Yeah. Well, I do reflect that if we could just subject government to this trial and error mechanism, we might improve it rather dramatically. And at the moment, government tends to be a monopolistic thing. One of the great secrets of the United States was that it invented a kind of government that wasn't monopolistic, where you could use the states as laboratories. And the federal system here did actually have advantages in that respect. And you saw this happening. What was it? Welfare reform started in Wisconsin or something. These kind of things happen. And I do think that would be rather wonderful to think in terms of competing alternative governments. And of course we do that. That's what voting is. You say, I want the Republicans or the Democrats to run my government for the next 4 years. But it's only every 4 years, whereas you can change your toothpaste instantaneously. Now, obviously, there's a lot of practicalities here. I'm not suggesting that necessarily that's the answer, but I do think that's one of the problems is the diversity of choice, the ability of things to go up against each other, to swap. And the other point is that governments are terrible at swapping ideas internationally. You know, our debate about healthcare in Britain runs on absolute tram lines. Your one over here runs on tram lines. And it turns out the French have a perfectly good system, and neither of us ever hear about it. You know what I mean? You know, so I do think that there's much too little exchange of ideas about how to run bureaucracies in government. That's one answer to your question. But institutions generally, I think to get the exchange of ideas among how to, I know what point I'm trying to make. Paul Romer, in his Charter Cities idea, where he wants to basically start a Hong Kong in Africa to spread the good practice of markets in Africa, he suggests that that it's not just tools, it's also rules. In other words, good rules can spread like wildfire. You know, good ideas about how to organize institutions can actually cross boundaries and do good things, and that's just as important as good new technologies.
Well, let's thank them.